When thinking about the fight for civil rights, most people think of oppressed minorities in the United States, such as Latinos, Asians, and most famously African Americans. What most people forget, however, are the American Indians. The indigenous population that has been living in the Americas since 8000 BCE, long before Columbus and Leif Erikson, are the most oppressed peoples in the United States. Some will argue that even up to the present day, after the civil rights movement of the 60s, American Indians are still oppressed and do not enjoy the rights and civil liberties that other citizens are granted. American Indians lived freely in America for 10,000 years. With a seemingly infinite amount of languages, cultures, and tribes, the American Indians thrived in their environment. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, he and the other explorers that followed brought diseases that killed 90% of the population in the Western Hemisphere, which is estimated to be 30 million American Indians. This resulted in 27 million deaths, which is the highest casualty rate in any genocide in world history. This may have seemed inevitable, as there were nothing anyone could do to stop the disease from spreading. But diaries from Cortez and other conquistadors show that their tactics to bring down large empires such as the Aztecs and Tlaxicans were to give them infected blankets and clothes to spread the diseases quicker. This epidemic spread to North America as well as crippling the population of tribes in the area that would soon be known as the United States. With a decimated population, American Indians lost much of their power that would be needed to stop the settlers in Virginia and Massachusetts. As the British, French, Portuguese, and Spanish pushed into America, the American Indians were pushed back. Britain displayed a harsh relationship towards the American Indians by practicing complete segregation, an idea that would later be practiced in the South towards African Americans. Laws legally separated white society from Indian society. For example, American Indians were prohibited from entering the city of Boston, a law that would not be removed until 2005. Strong cultural aggression also separated whites from Indians, as some violent tribes saw whites as a threat to their way of life, and whites saw Indians as wild animals looking to scalp isolated settlers for game. Scalping was actually a practice introduced by the British Empire during the French and Indian War, so Indians could be rewarded for the amount of enemies that they killed. Yet the public wrongfully perceived this as an American Indian cultural value. This perception also led to the belief that American Indians were not people, but just savage animals. The public criticized the lack of clothing, the nomadic living, and even their language as being very basic and inferior. To make the American public perception worse, most Native Americans sided with the French during the French and Indian War. The French respected the American Indians by trading with them, allowing them to have sovereignty over their lands, and getting into much fewer armed conflicts against them. The British, on the other hand, pushed American Indians off their land and limited trade with them. The Native Americans proved to be very useful allies to the French, leading a number of successful large-scale ambushes on the British, most notably at the Battle of Monongahela, where Braddock's army was turned back 10 miles from Fort Duquesne. The British Americans despised the American Indians after these defeats, viewing them as cowardly by fighting with the guerrilla-style tactics. These public perceptions would later pave the way for the United States-Indian relations in the future. The relocation process was different for every tribe. The 5 civilized tribes were forced from their land to travel to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, where 6,000 of 16,000 Cherokee died. The Sioux were allowed to stay on their land, but for every few years the United States would continue to force the Sioux to sign treaties that shrank their reservation. The reservations represented the loss of freedom for American Indians. Pre-Columbian American Indians have no concept of owning land. There were areas that were meant for a certain tribe to hunt, but no definite line where one person owned land. Forcing American Indians onto reservations not only limited their freedom, but it is an example of the United States eliminating Indian cultural values. After the Civil War, the United States would implement new policies to completely destroy American Indian culture. Most wars in America brought hope and opportunity for American Indians. Opposing sides would offer full sovereignty to Indian lands if they fought for their cause. Britain offered a re-establishment of the Proclamation Line of 1763 if Tecumseh's allies of American Indians fought against the United States in the War of 1812. The Confederate States of America offered respect to Indian territory as well as total sovereignty. American Indians formed one full army under an Indian general that led raids in the West against Grant and Sherman's army. Surprisingly, the Confederates integrated American Indian troops into regular regiments, something the United States would adapt almost 100 years later. During the Civil War, American Indians were rarely used by the United States and were in separate units. In World War I and II, Indians were still used in separate units but got national attention by being used for communication because other nations could not understand their native language. These code breakers were extremely useful in World War II because the Japanese could not understand the Navajo and Apache languages used for military instructions in the Pacific. However, this importance on American Indian language was not known in 1887 when the Dawes Severity Act was passed. The Dawes Act forced Native American children from their tribes to be educated in Pennsylvania. This free education was designed to prevent the older generation from teaching the Indian culture to the young. The Dawes Act granted citizenship to Native Americans that stayed on their reservation and cooperated with the United States. American Indians would have to wait 25 years to get their citizenship, while foreign immigrants could get their citizenship in 7. It would take until 1920. In the 1960s, the major civil rights movement brought American Indians together to join the movements. American Indians were upset with a lot of the same problems African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians faced. They faced harsh racism and insufficient funds for their schools. They also had unemployment issues and slum housing on reservation. American Indians also took this opportunity to bring back the broken treaties to the government. Throughout American history, the United States would make treaties with American Indians and break them a few years later. Most of these treaties were in favor of the United States, and the Indians that signed them usually couldn't read. In the 50s and 60s, AIM was a large movement for American Indians and was very active in the late 60s and early 70s. AIM led the spiritual walk to D.C. that succeeded when Congress passed the Indian Civil Rights Act, which guaranteed civil rights and equal protection. In 1972, AIM led the Trail of Broken Treaties across the country to protest the failure of the government to address the treaty's responsibilities. When this failed, it caused AIM to take a different approach. Before looking at Wounded Knee 2, it is important to understand what happened at the Wounded Knee Massacre. After the Dawes Act in 1887, American Indians adopted the Ghost Dance, which was a religious movement with the hopes and intentions that the Great Spirit would bring back the bison and remove the white man from America. While this idea may have seemed illogical, it united American Indians against the United States. The U.S. sent cavalry regiments into the West to break up the Ghost Dancers, and at a small town called Wounded Knee, things got bad. The 7th Cavalry ordered the confiscation of all guns owned by the Indians. One Indian was deaf, so he did not understand that he had to put down his gun. The cavalry regiment opened fire and slaughtered the Indians in the village. Reservations like Pine Ridge have high murder rates and are extremely poor. American Indians are now known for their drug and alcohol problems. This is partially because of their body's natural tolerance. By having no exposure to alcohol before Columbus denied the natural tolerance humans developed towards these things from their ancestors, causing American Indians to have addiction problems. But it is also partially because of hope. American Indians living on these reservations still today don't get the best education and are born into poverty, causing high depression rates.
Present-day Native Americans have been oppressed and ignored by the government and American culture as a whole. A lot of Americans believe that because of the New Buffalo's success in creating casinos as well as oil rackets, that most Indians have money and the reservations are nice places. This is not true at all. Many reservations are comparable to the living in third world countries. Unemployment has reached 85%. 97% of the population lives below the poverty line. Men and women's life expectancy barely reaches 50 years of age, over 20 years less than the national average. Infant mortality rate is also extremely high. The current Native American dropout rate is around 70%. The list of issues goes on because of the ignored problems and the stagnancy of the U.S. government. A specific reservation, which is notably known for its diabetic issues, is given foods high in sugar and carbs by the government. These Native American reserves are currently under such poor conditions that the natives have to fight not only for their lives, but for equality at the same time. From the 1400s up until present day, Native Americans have had to fight battles against oppression. Their culture is dying off, and there is very little that they can do to stop it.